3. The US bolsters its defenses. In 2012, word got out that the United States planned to build a new missile defense shield in southern Japan. The system was intended to protect against what intelligence officials identified as a growing threat from China and North Korea. Defense officials told the Wall Street Journal that a strong early warning radar called X-band would be implemented into the new anti-missile shield, and that it would connect to an existing system in northern Japan that had been in place since 2006. There were also plans for a third X-band installation, with the potential to monitor China, Taiwan, and North Korea. The decision was announced shortly after the People's Liberation Army of China tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, which was capable of reaching any city in the United States. Known as the DF-41 missile, it contains 10 warheads that can be programmed to strike at different locations. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, a US official told the news outlet Executive Gov that the American government perceived the missile test as an imminent threat and felt compelled to take steps to safeguard the country by bolstering its own defenses. The question of what might happen if the US and China go to war has been asked many times over the years, and the predictions have changed amid the constantly fluctuating tensions between the two superpowers. As national interest writer Robert Farley pointed out in 2021, at one time, the only fathomable motivation for a war between America and China would be a dispute over North Korea or Taiwan. And while this remains a distinct possibility, the list of potential reasons for a direct military conflict has grown in recent years. China's expanding interests and capabilities are major factors in the disagreements between the two countries. Over the last 20 years or so, China's wealth has skyrocketed. And in keeping with the old adage money is power, the country's impressive economic gains have given it major political foothold in world politics. Adding to these rapidly shifting power dynamics is the massive buildup and modernization of the Chinese military, a major priority of current President Xi Jinping, who plans on securing a third term later this year. In keeping with his goals, China comes second only to the US when it comes to spending the most money on their militaries. And while a huge portion of that spending has gone toward expanding its navy and building newer, better, and more advanced ships and other equipment, a sizable chunk of China's defense budget is spent on nuclear weapons. China is notoriously secretive about exactly how much money it spends. But based on the rate that things seem to be going, experts predict that the country could quadruple its nuclear stockpile by 2030, putting the number of warheads in its possession as high as 1,000. State-sponsored media scoffed at the claim, describing it as wild and biased speculation. Chinese officials insist that the country's nuclear arsenal is kept at a minimal level, but those keeping as close of an eye as possible on these operations adamantly disagree. Concerns based on actual evidence of China's nuclear buildup are exacerbated by its leaders' reluctance to engage in dialogue and work toward building trust with other countries. In addition to the production of ICBMs, China appears to have its sights set on developing hypersonic missiles. They travel at 5 times the speed of sound and are difficult to detect with radar, giving those at the target site almost no time to launch an effective defense. Much like officials have downplayed their nuclear efforts, they also denied their hypersonic ambitions. But in 2021, the country performed 2 test launches of a hypersonic missile. Both times, it flew around the globe before aiming for its target. The first time, the missile missed the mark by roughly 24 miles. Defense expert Dr. Zeno Leone told the BBC that China's top-ranking officials know that the country is behind when it comes to military technology, and that this is fueling its frenzied efforts to not only catch up to, but to supersede other countries. Some predict that China could become a major threat to Western countries in a relatively short time. For now, the US remains superior to China as far as nuclear weapons go. Jeffrey Lewis, who directs the East Asian Non-Proliferation Program at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, told the BBC that if the US waged a nuclear attack on Beijing, only a small number of China's nuclear stockpile would survive, and that America's nuclear defense system in Alaska might be able to handle what's left. Not all experts perceive China's growing military and weapons test as an emerging threat to the Western world. In fact, some believe that the country has been an ever-present threat since the 1980s. There are also disagreements on how to properly respond to the situation. Lewis believes that acting out of fear and vulnerability could prompt US officials to create disastrous foreign policies that do the opposite of protecting the country. He blames America's withdrawal from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile, an agreement between the US and the Soviet Union that limited the anti-ballistic missile systems that are used to defend against nuclear attacks. The treaty was meant to dissuade the parties from continuing to build nuclear weapons as a way to maintain deterrence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia decided to continue honoring the agreement, which remained in place until 2002, when the US withdrew. In the years since, nearly all of America's major adversaries have sought to expand their nuclear capabilities and arsenals. Some would argue that these countries, including the US, are embroiled in an ongoing global arms race, and that a lot of the ongoing development is fueled by the perceived need to perpetually strengthen a country against those who might attack it. Do you keep up with world politics? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. North Korea. The United States and North Korea have been deeply at odds since the emergence of the Hermit Kingdom and the Korean War between the Communist North and the capitalist South. America's continued support for South Korea and its vehement disapproval of North Korea's oppressive authoritarian dictatorship are just some of the reasons why the two countries don't get along. The looming prospect of massively destructive warfare between the US and North Korea has lingered for decades. From a young age, schoolchildren in North Korea are indoctrinated with beliefs that Americans are murderous imperialists who started the Korean War, even though the conflict actually began when North Korea invaded South Korea. This anti-American propaganda is especially effective given the dictatorship's all-out control over the media and the strict ban on spreading information or views that don't align with the regime's agenda. Simply put, it's easy to see why there are long-standing fears that the US and North Korea will eventually come to blows. After rising to power following his father's death in 2011, Kim Jong-un hugely stepped up the Hermit Kingdom efforts to develop powerful weapons of mass destruction. Since then, experts speculate that North Korea has amassed an arsenal of somewhere between 30 and 40 nuclear weapons. Some analysts estimate that Kim has acquisitioned enough materials to build as many as 100 nuclear weapons, indicating that the dictator's collection is likely to continue growing as he remains fixated on developing explosives with devastating capabilities. Concerns about political warfare between the US and North Korea have only grown in recent years. Donald Trump's presidency marked a distinct turning point in the rising tensions shortly after he took office in early 2016. As a man who's known for not mincing words, Trump wasted little time vocalizing his feelings about North Korea and its third-generation despot Kim Jong-un. And he did so in his trademark inflammatory way, taunting Kim for his obsession with building nuclear weapons and mockingly referring to him as Rocket Man. In response, Kim called Trump a mentally deranged dotard. At first glance, the interactions may have seemed like the type of obnoxious tit-for-tat that most self-respecting adults roll their eyes at. But the gravity of the words being slung back and forth hit differently for those who found themselves seriously questioning the mental stability of both leaders. It was even more terrifying to think about the fact that the disagreeing parties both had the power to deploy explosives that could claim hundreds of thousands of lives with the push of a button. Oddly, the war of words somehow led to plans for Trump and Kim to sit down for a civilized discussion on how to potentially work past the two countries' differences and move forward peacefully. The meeting took place in 2019 in the demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, which separates North and South Korea. During the historic summit, the two leaders signed an agreement to work together toward establishing a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. The agreement called for the resuming of nuclear talks between the US and North Korea, which were previously stalled. But many critics responded to the news with doubt that the agreement was anything more than symbolic, or that Kim Jong-un had any realistic plans to uphold his end of it. The meeting also drew angered responses from those who believe that as a democratic country that believes in freedom, the US has no room for negotiating with tyrannical rulers who commit horrific human rights abuses. Many were appalled to learn that Trump described crossing the 38th parallel as an honor, and that he invited Kim to visit him at the White House. Not surprisingly, little seems to have come of the talk between Trump and Kim, which marked the first time a sitting US president crossed the armistice line at the 38th parallel. Current President Joe Biden has taken a less open-minded stance toward any sort of diplomatic interactions with Kim, who has continued to test nuclear weapons with alarming frequency. At the very least, the US and North Korea remain no further away from the chances of going to war than the two countries were before Trump's unconventional attempt at squashing a nuclear threat. Many believe that Kim would never take the hugely self-destructive step of attacking a country as powerful as the United States, while others think that the dictator remains one of the country's biggest threats. At this juncture, only time will tell. 1. China looks towards Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi recently stopped in Taiwan amid escalating tensions between China and the US. She was the first speaker from the House of Representatives to visit the self-governing island in 25 years, and to many, her timing couldn't have been worse. The Chinese government, which claims ownership over Taiwan, was outraged by Pelosi's visit, which she claimed was to promote democracy. It's no surprise that China felt provoked by a top-ranking American politician visiting a place that insists on being independent and vehemently resists Chinese rule. But to add insult to injury, Pelosi is a well-known supporter of Taiwan and a critic of China, with a history of calling the country out for its human rights violations. In other words, she's not exactly the first person who comes to mind when it comes to thinking of people who might be able to bridge gaps rather than deepen existing ruptures. Regardless of Pelosi's intentions, her visit had a less than diplomatic effect on China-US relations. In response to the audacious move, the Chinese government made it clear that it's done cooperating with the US on several key issues, including climate change, military discussions, and anti-drug efforts. The country also fired numerous missiles in the waters off Taiwan following Pelosi's appearance, and visibly increased its military presence in the region, performing massive drills around the island. Even before Pelosi's trip, it was clear that many believed it was a bad idea. President Biden reportedly admitted that he knew the visit was not a good idea right now, and even reminded Chinese President Xi Jinping ahead of the speaker's travels that he couldn't stop her from going to Taiwan. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman described the planned visit as utterly dangerous, reckless, and irresponsible. He warned that the politician's purely symbolic appearance would do nothing to benefit Taiwan, and that the trip could potentially immerse the US into indirect conflicts with other nuclear-armed countries, including China and Russia, possibly at the same time. Friedman went on to speculate that the US probably wouldn't receive much, if any, support from its European allies if it became entangled in a dispute with China. China's heavily militarized response and cold cutoff of discussions with the US has sparked concerns that an attack on Taiwan is a distinct possibility. And while Pelosi's visit seemed to mark a turning point in the deterioration of China-US relations, some have argued that things have been on a declining trajectory for some time. From an official standpoint, the US adheres to a one-China policy, which means that it considers Taiwan to be under Chinese jurisdiction. But the recent actions of several leaders seem to speak to the contrary. When asked earlier this year if the US would defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack, President Joe Biden boldly and without hesitation said, "Yes, that's the commitment we made." His commentary sparked both annoyance and confusion. Based on the policies in place, the US is required to provide Taiwan with the resources to defend itself if needed. But the terms don't allot for direct military intervention. The lack of clarity resulting from the conflict between policy and politicians' words only seems to be fueling China's frustration. And while it's unclear whether these rising tensions could erupt into armed conflict or missile attacks anytime soon, the atmosphere surrounding the situation increasingly feels like that of a ticking time bomb. Thanks for watching. What do you think of these potential missile launches? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.